A couple of years ago, we talked to Hector Garcia about evolutionary psychology, and he really pushed this idea of the importance of making the normal seem strange, of sort of like getting away and divorcing ourselves from our cultural assumptions. And to that end, I am constantly trying to remind people that sex is not this like magical thing that has a distinct beginning and a distinct end. And you can't come in from the outside and declare whether or not sex has happened. Like, it's very arbitrary. Is a blowjob sex? Is cyber sex? Is I like to be as broad with that term as absolutely possible. And I guess I am just curious, as we are looking around the globe and kind of considering some of these other cultures, how you guys imagine that our world would change if we sort of deconsecrated sex in that way, and reminded ourselves that it's really just meat slapping together, or whatever else we want to describe it as, but that it is not this like magical holy act that has like any specific components.
Yeah, I love that. Like that's kind of where a lot of my activism has actually been lately is normalizing sex and gender and all that stuff. So the idea of you use the word deconsecrate. I love that because we really do hold sex up on this pedestal that it's this thing that we have to cherish and be careful with, and we have to be very very guarded about it. Not just about how we have sex and who we have sex with, but how we talk about sex and when and who we talk about sex with. It's a very taboo topic, and that's just the regular traditional missionary type sex. You start getting into kinks, and now you're in this whole other world of, am I allowed to say this, or should we talk about that, or I have to keep this private, so that there's probably a lot out there that's very normal that the average everyday person who's doing it secretly doesn't realize that they're perfectly okay and they're perfectly normal because we refuse to make it okay to talk about this stuff. So I love that you put that in there in the show notes when I read them, and I love that you're talking about it now. Just the idea that the more that we look at other cultures and how they approach sex, or the more that we reflect on, okay, is there a biological purpose to this being bad or wrong, or is it cultural or religious? Is it a dogma or a belief that's holding me back from thinking that this is okay? Right? I
Yeah,
mean, clearly
even
there's
from
things
our
that aren't okay, but we need to know where that line is.
yeah, and that line is something that we have to be having conversations about, right? Like, not just
Absolutely.
reading ancient poetry about.
Mm.
Even within our own society, there are some really interesting and bizarre kind of cultural distinctions here. If you go to a kink party, you're going to find a fair number of people who are polyamorous, but there are a lot of folks in that community that are strictly monogamous. But then what does strictly mean? And what does monogamous mean? Because when you're talking about kink, like, is two fully clothed people giving each other a spanking, is that sex? Like, does that violate our monogamy? We talk about these things much too simplistically oftentimes, and
Mm.
I'm glad that we are kind of breaking some of these ideas down tonight.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, don't get me wrong. The way that I've always kind of looked at it is, missionary sex is kind of like vanilla ice cream. Like, sure, vanilla's pretty good, but give me some Rocky Road, baby, and let me loose.
And sometimes you
You know?
just feel like the vanilla, right? And that's
Yeah,
okay.
sometimes you want some
Yeah.
vanilla, sometimes you want chocolate, sometimes you want the black
Sometimes it's
cherry.
rainbow sherbet and you just want it all.
Oh
Yeah.
Just
yeah.
go for it.
Yeah.
Well, we've said it already tonight, but so much of what we take as biology around gender and sexuality is actually just culture, and I'm tired of pretending it isn't.
Yeah.
Do y'all have any examples of sort of culturally bound, like, biological facts that we hold on to? Maybe we shouldn't.
So I know you brought up a couple. I don't know if you want to be the one to talk about those, but the one that I'm going to steal from you is
Yeah,
that you
please.
can break the hymen. Like I when I read that, I was like, that's one of those myths that still goes around today. And so just to get into like a little biological lesson, it's more like a scrunchie, right? Like it's a tight, like a sphincter sort of in a way, and it stretches as you become sexually active and as as it's penetrated, right? But it never breaks. It's not broken. It's not like you can have it back intact again, right? Um,
Well, it's not like
and,
it's a seal that's just like
yeah,
waiting to be punctured. It's not the top of a Snapple bottle that goes like pop, and then it's
what's that?
like
There's a
out and it never
soda, a
comes back.
Japanese soda that you push the ball into the soda. Like you have to push the ball down and it pops into the soda. And that's kind of what I think about when I think about that specific myth, right? But
Oh man.
Yeah,
but
and
there's
that is very culturally bound. That's something that you can see in particularly like Western and Christian cultures going back for a ways, but they're not universal by any means.
yeah, and I think one of the biggest myths that's still out there that we were talking about before the show is everything around gender and transgender, right? The idea that whatever you're born with biologically is what you are, or that sex is just determined by your what's on the outside, right? Like your physical
Mm-hmm.
sexual traits. And I think that that's the one that the activist communities are battling the most, and they get the most argument with is the idea that biology is so cut and dry. I know we've talked about it a lot on this show, but that is something that I think we need to really push hard.
Yeah, and there are so many examples of this, and they're difficult. They're kind of ineffable in a way because your culture very much is the lens you see the world through. So it's very easy to have blind spots. But something else that I maybe want to highlight as being kind of understood as like a culturally bound idea is actually the notion of PMS. I
Mhm.
don't want to sound for a second like I am dismissing the discomfort or the experiences of pain and suffering that anybody who feels PMS goes through. I'm not trying to say that that's not real. I'm not trying to tell you it's all in your head or anything silly like that. I don't mean to dismiss your suffering. But the whole notion of PMS, the whole notion of being moody and erratic and irrational and hormonal right before your period is a pretty like Western and kind of in particular American notion that we just don't really see showing up in a lot of other cultures. And there's
Hmm.
a lot to be said about why that fact is. But the truth is, the hormone levels are not dramatically different on the other side of the globe. The biology is not dramatically different on the other side of the globe. This is a cultural construct that we just sort of assume is like hardwired into our DNA when in reality it really isn't.
So that's
Good
a super
point.
super interesting one because I'm pretty meticulous about tracking my period and my cycles and stuff, and we do go through hormone changes throughout the month. Women do. Interestingly, men do too. So if you want to say there's PMS, there's men have the same thing women do in terms of their hormones cycling and dipping and rising. Um, but yeah, the hey, women get bitchy once a month. Things like that. A lot of it is just, I don't know what you would call that, like, when you have, like, that joke that you learn as a five-year-old, and then you have a five-year-old and they come home from school with the same joke, and you're like, "Well, that's still around today," right? It's just one of those things that gets passed on and on and on from generation to generation, but there's really no bearing for it. But there's some truth to, hormone levels in males and females cycling throughout the month and that changing the way you feel, whether you're more sensitive or whether you feel more energized or less energized. There is a degree of truth to that. But when you start to do these big stereotypical overgeneralizations, you start to lose all the subtlety to it and you start to misunderstand what's really going on. And so
Yeah,
when you see a
and
person
as you
being
point
a
out, like it's
bitch,
happening to men in
yeah,
very similar sort of fashion, but we don't have a cultural construct for that. Right? And so that
right,
just kind of highlights for me that the narrative here is really telling the story, and the narrative
absolutely.
is perhaps somewhat divorced from facts.